Welcome back to Programming with Qt Widgets. Today we'll look at a set of classes which are likely both the curse and the blessing of model view, namely the proxy model classes. If you think back 6, 7 or whatever it takes amount of episodes till when we started model view, I asked what is the benefit of a model view structure, and one of the answers that might have popped into your head is that you can have multiple views on the same model. Have a look here at my screen now where I have a model that is providing data. It's providing both audio files and video files. So enjoy the silence. By now you might have guessed this is from Depeche Mode. And The Matrix, well, you definitely know that movie, I'm sure. That is shown in a list view. And in that list view, or table or tree or whatever, I see both the audio and the videos. But imagine that I had another view where I wanted to only show the audios. And I wanted both of those views to be available or active at the same time. How would I solve that problem? Unless you are straight into programming and this is one of your first few minutes of programming, then in place of the question mark, you likely already formed the thought that you got to place some class that can convert what we have in the model into a subset that we have in the view. If you've been around the block for more than 10 minutes and read perhaps half a book on programming, you might already have formed an opinion that what is going to be in place of the question mark is something that is rhyming on Proxy, namely proxy. And you are indeed totally right. What will be in place of the question mark is a proxy model. And before we go and see what a proxy model really is, just observe that we have a view up here, likely in this setup here, a QList view. Down here we have a subclass of QAbstractProxyModel. And if this one here was a subclass of QAbstractProxyModel, the view would not know that there was somebody in between it and the real model. And remember from when we started talking about model view, the real interface to the real data that is sitting down here. So our proxy models are indeed subclassing from QAbstractProxyModel. In addition to that, the model also needs to behave as if it was a view, because to this model down here, it is a view. And obviously the proxy model is the one calling onto the model as the view here is calling onto this proxy model. But behind the scenes, there's also a call from downstairs up from the model to the proxy model and from the proxy model to the view. And you might be saying, Jesper, does that mean that the model have a pointer to the proxy model? And of course it doesn't. Not directly, but through signals. The model down here will emit a bunch of signals like data changed or rows inserted or model reset or whatever. And this proxy model needs to listen to those exactly like a real view at the top is listening to those. And when a data change comes in here, it shouldn't just send a data change up there. It should consider what does that mean to my data and then possibly emit a data change to the view above or a rows inserted or whatever the proxy model is about. So just to give you an idea of what can be proxied or what would a proxy model possibly do. I have a screen here of text, and Robert, can you please turn it back to full screen of me? Thank you very much, because if you had that on your screen, you'd just be reading what I'm reading for you now, and that would kind of ruin all the fun. So what are good examples of proxy models? Well, filtering and sorting is definitely a good example. So the filtering was what we saw in the previous slide where we had only the audio files shown. Sorting might be a job for a proxy model if there is some magic sorting that needs to go on. And actually it will most of the time be the proxy model via the special proxy model called QSortFilterProxyModel, a good easy name to take into your beer games. QSortFilterProxyModel, 20 times after that. Okay, removing columns is another good example. So if I had, that's basically just filtering on columns, but it could be that I wanted to merge two columns together, for example. Embellishing data for presentation. So if you want, you could create a proxy model that highlights negative numbers in reds, or which add checkboxes for specific columns or something like that. Reordering cells in general is what proxy models can do, and we will talk a bit about a specific one of these a bit later in this episode here. Flattening into a list. So if you have a tree of something and you want to show it as a list, that is definitely possible, and I've even created one of these myself. And finally, grouping items from a list, that is creating a tree. So we saw the list of some video files and some audio files. We could have that be a tree where the first level was either audio or video, and then the second level of that tree was the audio or video files. Again, a job that very easily could be done by a proxy model. And the final one, which isn't even in my list here, which is my thinking of a proxy model whenever somebody asks me at 3 o'clock in the morning, and that happens a lot. You'll be surprised how often my dog wakes me up and say, hey, can you explain to me what is a proxy model? Or can you give me a good example of a proxy model? And I say, well, I have this data set of something that happens over 10 years. And I can plot that as a long data set. But what the financial people really want is to have it plotted year on year, which means that I'll only have January, February, March, and up to December on the x-axis, and then I'll have one line plot for each year, which makes it possible for me to see fluctuation that happens over summer or winter or some other time frame. That is a proxy model that takes in a real model that is basically just a column of numbers and converts it into a table that shows the data one column for every year. You gotta love Qt. Write your software once, deploy it everywhere. Yeah, as if. There are so many things besides just compiling your software on a foreign platform. So if you're familiar with Windows or Mac or some Unix version, but not with the others, and you want to go there, reach out to us and we can help you. Okay, enough talking about generalities. Let's see some proxy models in action. And what you see here on the slide now is an instance of some model that is at the base of things. And I create a view, and so far line 1 and 2 would be what I usually would see, and then line 3 would be saying something like view set model. But what I do here on line 4 is that I create an instance of an existing proxy model that actually exists, QSortFilterProxyModel. I give it a parent, that's just the object's parent-child relationship. It doesn't have anything to do with the model view framework itself. And now I say proxy, set source model model. So I tell the proxy that if you need any answers to any of your questions, you go and talk to model. And the view, I say view, if you need any answers to any questions, you go and talk to the proxy. And what will happen is that the view will be asking, hey model, how many rows do you have with the Q model index parenthesis open parenthesis close as the parent? And the proxy model will say, ooh, that's a good question. I will have to ask on. And what will it ask on? Will it ask how many rows do you have? Likely, but it could be a proxy model that is swapping columns to be rows and rows to be columns, transposing proxy model. In that case, it would not go and ask for number of rows. It would actually go and ask for number of columns. So what the proxy model does in response to the view depends entirely on what the proxy model is all about. But in any case, it needs to answer how many rows do you have, and the proxy model will somehow figure that out and answer that back. And figuring it out will be done by calling the API of QAbstractProxyModel on the model that was given to it using the set source model here in line 7. Okay, now we've seen how we instantiate a proxy model and set it up with the view and the source model. So how do I implement it myself? Well, I can either subclass and implement, or I can use, which in many cases is what I'll do, one of the 2 pre-existing proxy model classes in Qt. So let's start with the 2 pre-existing model ones. We have the QIdentityProxyModel. That's when I only change the data, not the structure. So I'm not going from a list to a table, or from a table to another table with a different dimension, or from a tree to another tree with a different structure of parent-child relationship. I'm going from a tree that has 8 nodes at the top. As a first child, it has 1 node, and the second child has 3 nodes, to a tree that has 8 nodes at the top, and well, you get the idea. The structure is not changed. That's a QIdentityProxyModel. I can either subclass it or I can use it directly. Most cases I'll simply subclass and override the data method. And in the data method, I would, for example, call upon the source model and say, what is the data that you have? And it'll say, it is -27. I'll say, ooh, okay. If the display role is -27, then the foreground color role of me should be red because it's a negative number. The other one I have is QSortFilterProxyModel, and I'll show you both of these further on, but let's just have one of those Zen moments where I just go, because you gotta love the irony in this. We're talking about how to separate the mess of data that you could have when you have multiple different things that should happen. You separate that out of the model into a number of proxy models, and the one class we're going to use most of the time takes both sort and filtering in one class. You gotta love the irony in that. But anyway, QSortFilterProxyModel is the one that you'll be using either for sorting or for filtering, and especially for the filtering part, you will most often subclass and implement a few methods. But if you need to do something where it's not just sorting or filtering and not just changing the data, possibly the display data into the foreground color roles data, but really changing the structure from a tree to a table or whatever, or from a table with dimension 8 times 3 to a table with dimension 3 times 215, I don't know. In that situation, what you will be doing is subclassing from QAbstractProxyModel. Or you better stay tuned, because there is one alternative, which I would choose in many of those situations. But I'll talk to you about that a bit later. There are 2 links here on this slide to KItemModel, which is an LGPL framework with a bunch of predefined models that, or proxy models that is from the KDE framework. And there is KDE Toolbox, which is, if I remember correct, MIT licensed, which allows you to see a bunch of proxy models. And some of these proxy models might be exactly what you need. And some of them might just be a good inspiration to how to implement your own proxy models. What? You need to go back and do your real work? Watching me is not your real work? Gee, okay, I understand. And it is actually a good time for now to end this episode. In the next episode, I'll show you a number of examples of proxy models. And it also gives me an opportunity in the next episode to repeat what I've said up until now, and gives me an opportunity to just repeat what I've said in this episode. This is a good technique for helping you remember stuff. So proxy models is a subclass of QAbstractProxyModel that you put in between your view and your real model. And of course, you could put multiple proxy models in. I have an episode on Qt Widgets and more. I'll give you a link to that episode a bit later on, where I have a stack of, I think, 5 or 6 proxy models that each and every one is doing one tiny little part of the job. Yes, it will be more expensive, and possibly if you profile, you might want to make some of those go together. But at least initially splitting them up makes the code much more readable. You call set source model on the view, gives it the proxy model, call set source model on the proxy model to give it the actual model. And I think on the view you just call set model, but that's not the key thing here. And you have at least two different kind of models or proxy models. You have those that changes not the structure, that are the QIdentityProxyModel, and those that are either changing the structure by removing some lines or reordering the lines, and these are the QSortFilterProxyModels. And then the general version is the QAbstractProxyModel, I think it was called. I have it up here, QAbstractProxyModel. That is the most generic one. That is a subclass still of QAbstractItemModel. And in the next version, I'll tell you that a lot of times, oh, I shouldn't tell you now. Well, I will anyway. A lot of times, I wouldn't be implementing that. I would simply implement my own QAbstractItemModel and behave as if I was a proxy model. But more on that in the next episode. Until then, have a great time.